Hey friends, let's talk about why Ukraine matters. From the United States, from Western Europe, it's easy to look at the war in Ukraine and chalk it off to a regional conflict. Who cares how the war turns out? If Ukraine stands their ground, great. The world's going to be a little bit of a brighter place. But if Russia succeeds in occupying Ukraine, well, then weren't they part of Russia anyway? Is it going to be such a tragedy? Really, how is it going to have an effect on our lives? How is it going to have an effect on the way we perceive the world? Maybe it's not such a big deal. Friends, it's a mistake to think about it. I will argue in 3 points that attack on Ukraine is an attack on civilized world order. And if Russia does succeed, it's going to have staggering effects on how the Western world will perceive itself and what's going to happen within Western world. And it's going to throw us back 50 years, 50, 70 years to the Cold War, where we're expecting a nuclear war at any point. Before I offer my 3 arguments, let me preamble this by saying this. In the last 10, 20 years, the wars that have been dominating a news cycle, it was easy to distance emotionally from those wars because they were happening, let's say, in the Middle East or in Afghanistan. And even though it was a tragedy, even though people were dying, those were not people we could identify with. Those people did not share our values. They did not have fair elections. They did not have equal rights. They were subjugating their women. So in some sense, it was easy to distance ourselves from there and say, well, war, of course, is wrong, but we're not going to make a personal tragedy out of this. Let's talk about Ukraine. And this is my argument number 1, is that Ukraine is a Western country. You may have heard from Russian propaganda that had seeped into the Western world quite a bit, is that Ukraine has been the vassal of Russia, and ideologically and politically and militarily, they sort of are this special people, the special isolationist state that had been broken up in 1991, and nobody knows what to do with it. Ukraine cannot really find their ground or define who they are. Well, friends, I'm going to tell you this, that Ukrainians have always been pro-freedom. They've always been pro-equal rights and pro-democracy. Even before Russia was ever a thing, the Ukrainian state, Kievan Rus, starting in 7th century, has been a formidable, significant European power. It has had dealings with Byzantine Empire, Roman Empire before that, with the Polish state later on, with Lithuanian state. The Ukrainian Kiev kings have been married into European dynasties, and it had been a trade power, a military power. It had been integrated into European way of life with the values that were held by Europeans at that point. And as I have talked in previous videos about this, Russia has been more influenced by the Mongolian culture, by the Mongolian way of rule, by the Golden Horde, and they have been able to survive or become that big because they were subjugated by the Golden Horde in its time. So ideologically, Ukraine, which was at that point defined all the lands belonging to Kiev, has always ideologically been with Europe, and later on with the Russian Empire and Soviet Union, we have been occupied by Russians. But by my mentality, by values, and even to this day, Ukrainians are along with the democratic Western world. We believe in the same values of equal rights, of democracy, of freedom, as the rest of the world. So the attack on Ukraine is not really an attack on Ukraine itself. Ukraine in this case is proxy, which leads me to point number 2, is that if you listen to Putin's speeches, Russian attack is the attack on Western world. And in fact, Ukraine is not even being the evil here, because what Putin is saying is that the West is really the propagator of evil. The West is really the propagator of decadence, of godlessness, and we are here to save the world. And Ukraine to him is more of like a girlfriend who had walked away from him and is now being spoiled by the West, is now being influenced by the evil West. So his ultimate goal is not Ukraine. Ukraine is proxy. His ultimate goal is the West. So that's why the attack on Ukraine, the hubris that he's had, and the idea that he's having, it's not against Ukraine, it's against the West. So the threat of of the war in Ukraine is really against the West. And the Western world understands this. The EU, the United States, have been helping Ukraine in all kinds of ways, even with military and economically, and with sanctioning Russia for their actions. So we're seeing that the world does understand this. This is not just another conflict. Ukraine has never been a country where there always been some kind of civil war. There's always been kind of violence in between people. No, Ukraine is a peaceful country. Ukraine has been since 1991 building democratic institutions inside of the country in order to go up to the standards and way of life of the developed world. That's why the attack of Russia on Ukraine is really an attack on the Western values, and it is against the West. And number three, actually, let me add something to number two. Ukraine is a shield to the West. So for all the reasons which I've talked about before, Ukraine sort of stands in between the crazy Russian Empire, the crazy dictator, and the rest of the world. Because as we know from Putin himself, as we know from his deputies, from the intelligence we're getting from American reconnaissance, that the plan is that if Ukraine does fall, then they're going to go into the rest of Europe. That is not a supposition at this point. This is not a conjecture at this point. This is confirmed information. Okay, number three. Ukraine is important because it exposes the weakness of the Western position. It exposes the weakness of Western position. Let me illustrate this with the example of NATO. So as you know, in 1945, when the Allied powers had reached capitulation of Germany and Japan, pretty much right away, the West had started to perceive the Soviet Union as being the threat. So even though they were allied in the war because against the common enemy, but then later they have pretty much started to build plans how to protect themselves against each other. The Soviet Union went back into isolation with their own policies, and there were a number of policies that Europe and America started created a number of organizations, such as the EU, which was called European Commission at that time, but also but one of the strongest defense alliance, NATO, was created at this point specifically to oppose the threat of communist Soviet Union. So now Soviet Union, of course, has devolved into Russia because Moscow was the center of Soviet Union, Moscow is the center of Russia. The way they hold their external affairs, the way they hold they build their government, the way the methods they use, it all comes from Soviet Union. Putin himself was an agent of KGB, and we still see that he uses the same methods as in KGB playbook. So it's safe to say that Russia is really the heir of Soviet Union. So now that the threat of Soviet Union is actually here, NATO cannot do anything. NATO is too afraid of a nuclear war. So two things you will hear every time an official from NATO speaks. Thing number one is that we will never directly engage with Russia. And they stop short of saying because of we're afraid of nuclear war, and that's a fair thing. I will talk about that later. But always number two, what they follow up with is that, but we are committed to protect every inch of the territory of Article 5 countries. And what is Article 5? Of course, it's the article from a NATO agreement that says that attack on one of the members of the NATO is an attack on everybody else. So the weakness of this position is that what is the difference if they cross Ukraine? If Ukraine does fall and Russia goes into Lithuania, let's say, because intelligence says that's the most likely scenario, is that Lithuania is next. Is the threat of nuclear war going away? Of course it's not going away. So what is the point of kicking the can down the road and saying, well, we don't want to engage with Russia because of nuclear war? Because if Ukraine does fall, you're going to have one less ally, but the threat is going to be the same. And more so, knowing Russia and the back alley thug that he is, he knows that you're afraid of this. He's going to use it for more and more reasons, for smaller and smaller reasons. You don't want to lift sanctions off. What about a nuke in your country? And that is not speculation. That is something, that is a prediction that one of the war experts in Russia is saying, who is in opposition. So this threat is not going to go away. So what is the difference between putting that line in Western Ukraine and saying, well, we're going to protect every inch of this territory, but not in Ukraine? The threat is not going to go away. Russia is still going to be Russia, even if Ukraine falls. So that is the weakness of the position. That is because the West, in Europe in this case, especially, has become so complacent, has become so entangled with a business and otherwise economic interest in Russia that they cannot do anything. They're terrified by the possibility of them having to engage Russia, even though everybody understands that in the face of Putin, his forces are pure evil, for the lack of better phrase. And number 3B, let's say, is that the reason that Putin attacked at this point is that he perceived the weakness of the West. So one of my most favorite political commentators has said that with Russia, their MO is push where there is mush, right? So wherever they perceive they can push where there's softness, they will always do that. They will always try to do something. If there's no strong reaction, they will go further and further and further. So what Putin has perceived is that, well, in America, new president Joe Biden, he perceived him to be a weak president. He looked at European dependence on his oil and natural gas and other business interests, and he perceived them to be weak. And then he looked at Ukraine, at a young president who comes from entertainment, and of course, what is he going to do? And thankfully, none of those were true predictions. Joe Biden has shown us great support. Union has come together to repel Russia's leverages or pushes they've been trying to make, and Zelensky turned out to be a pure miracle. I didn't expect that from him, but we see that the West needs to rethink their position, because this is not only about this war. It's not only about the nuclear threat. This is about a threat to the world order. There's a civilized world order that had set itself up after the World War II and had been serving as a machine for prosperity for everybody participating in it. So that is why Ukraine is so important, is because it's bearing the brunt between the deranged ambitions of a dictator and the world that is and a world order that is based on equality and freedom and democracy, that had shown itself to be prosperous for everybody participating in it. That is why Ukraine is so important. So friends, I thank you for your support. I thank you for your active civil position, and that you're supporting us with everything you can. And I wanted to make sure that we understand that this is not only about helping Ukraine. This is about actually preserving the civilized world.